7 years ago, when I started to work on plastic pollution, I remember walking into a recycling facility in Goa in India. It was a glass recycling facility, had nothing to do with plastic, but I saw clearly a miner, maybe 10, 11 years old, with two 10-liter buckets of water in each hand, no shoes, horrible working conditions. I saw kids working on landfills. I've seen people sitting in the mud in monsoon times, sorting through waste. I've seen the dark side of recycling with my own eyes. At Cleanup, we never thought about plastic pollution as only an environmental topic, but we knew that there's a social aspect as well. And this conversation is a bit about our own journey of social compliance. Kate, who's coming onto the show, is an expert in the field, and we've been working with her since 6 years now, since almost the very beginning of Cleanup.
Preventing health and safety has immediate productivity benefits in companies. Having a finger cut off, having a finger stamped, falling over. I've seen a factory have a fire and lose everything. It actually does happen, this stuff. If people feel like the workplace is really unsafe, if they find a safer opportunity somewhere else with the same wages, they'll go there.
I've learned so much from her, and with this episode I want to make more of that knowledge public, because I think the more people act on their supply chains, the better the world becomes. So without further ado, this is Kate Larsen from Supply Exchange.
The Striving, presented by CleanHub.
Hi Kate, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, always great to work with CleanHub.
Yeah, and today's topic is exactly about that, about the past almost 6 years of partnership. And we partnered on the topic of social compliance. And I think this is a topic that is giving nightmares, sleepless nights to a lot of sustainability professionals, especially those in the circular economy, especially those that are dependent on supply chains that start with waste, that start in difficult working conditions.
Right.
And before we get into the nitty-gritty, it would be great if you can just give a bit of background on yourself. What makes you an expert? Why does it make sense to partner with you?
Thanks. Well, it's great to work with CleanHub, and I'm so glad that the waste industry, as you say, so to speak, and the recycling world and circular world have been looking at social conditions for people who process waste for many years. I'm one of many who spent about 25 years, and some before me longer, on factory supply chain labor standards. I studied Chinese at university and business, and then went off to work in China in nonprofit, and then ended up in the world of corporate social responsibility around 2002, and then going into factories in China and then across Asia, looking at labor conditions for the people who make our things, and originally for a lot of the big brands, the more famous sort of high street household name brands, which CleanHub and your industry is slowly becoming. So worked with suppliers and talking to workers, and with many of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, those charities and advocates for decent conditions and decent work, on causing decent work around the world, and beyond China and Asia as well. But I particularly worked on the ground in China and Asia.
Take me to 2002. I was 11 years old. I didn't care much about supply chains back then, but I know that at this time around, a lot of them made in China also started.
Yeah.
What were the conditions like?
So those were the days when companies like Nike and Levi's and Gap came under pressure to look at the conditions for those factories they'd, as you say, recently outsourced to in Asia, which has started with sort of Taiwan and Japan, Korea, and then moved into China. And in those days, there were a lot of issues around workers in China in particular struggling to get permits. So they were migrant workers from a long distance. We still find this in all sorts of supply chains, including in the waste industry. And the challenges they would face in terms of labor standards was that, and human rights was that they often couldn't leave their factories and could face issues with the police if they tried to step outside the factory premises, even just to buy basic things they needed or to try to change job. Sometimes they weren't being, they obviously many times weren't being paid the legal minimum wage rate and the overtime rates properly, but also in those days often couldn't get contracts and the conditions were less safe. There used to be fires occasionally in factories and working really excessive hours. And so some of this still goes on, and there's a lot of work still across thousands of companies these days to look at conditions. But what's been exciting with CleanHub is that we've been able to learn from the experience of those industries in the past and what worked and didn't to help suppliers understand the importance of decent conditions. And I think the big learning that, credit to you, Joel, as a CleanHub founder and to the CleanHub team is to the learning that we need to support those suppliers and stick with them and reward them with business if they're making those improvements for workers. So those are some of the learnings from the efforts and failures of back in 2002 and what didn't work, but what did as well, and how we do cause improvements that are sustainable for all parties.
Yeah, because this is a bit the direction that I also want to take this conversation at a later stage. It's like, how can we compare what happened in fashion to the waste industry? But I want to stay on these early days of social compliance a little bit more. What was actually driving the need to look deeper into the supply chains? Why did suddenly brands wake up and say, like, oh my God,
Yeah,
we have to do something?
great question. So a couple of things. Firstly, just sort of awareness. And so media doing sort of scandal stories around, and the term Nike sweatshop is something I was hearing in those years, which is still kind of resonates with a lot of older generation, that term, that worry. And then the reason that was a concern is just the humanity of how other human beings being treated for our T-shirts and shoes and whatever. And then secondly, also that if people abroad, if a company can pay less for a product because people abroad weren't paid very much, then that takes away the balance of people back home getting a decent job. And this whole globalization conversation that, yes, global trade is really valuable. And as a globe, as a world, we need to work together and share our talents across different cultures and industries and expertise. And yet we need to do that in a way that doesn't undercut ourselves and others as well. We want it to be competitive for countries in our own, companies or organizations in our own countries to hire people and provide decent work back home. And that doesn't mean no trade. It just means fairer or more ethical trade. And so we also saw around that time the emergence of the Ethical Trading Initiative for that reason, that believes in trade, that can give development and opportunity and in life, the sustainable development goals, outcomes of social development. But we do it in a way that doesn't just undercut workers and employees and communities everywhere.
Can I just ask you, what was the worst thing that you've seen in these early days?
Gosh.
Are you allowed to share that?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of in the 2000s. I mean, I've never forgotten seeing this sort of, these two young boys. One was about 10 or 11, the other was about 8, and they were very clearly in an extreme bonded labor situation in a little backstreet workshop. I mean, the other thing that's amazing is that our supplier thought it was okay to take me there and that our company might be interested in buying things from there, which we weren't, which then became a real dilemma because we're just never going to buy from these sorts of conditions. And yet, so now I have no influence to help improve conditions for these young boys in this bonded labor situation. So those are the types of dilemmas that are really, really hard in this work is, on the one hand, you want to work with suppliers and drive improvements. And but there needs to be a base of at least an ability for that to be achieved. We've never had to deal with a dilemma that extreme in Clean Hub or almost any other. It's only once or twice I've had to deal with the dilemma. Most of the time, 90% of the time, we're talking about small improvements with so many companies I work with about, the pay was just below minimum, or the overtimes weren't paid perfectly, or the contract needs improving, or we need to reduce some excessive working hours here or there, or, a bit of safety training and things like that. And there's so much to do in all of that. But occasionally you get that sort of 1 in 100 case where it is just so extreme that you cannot possibly work with a supplier with those sorts of conditions. And yeah, those boys were living in a sort of a dirt back streets hovel kind of place and up these stairs. And then they had a gas cooker on a wooden floor, and the safety was atrocious, but obviously they weren't even being paid, and they shouldn't be working at the age of 11 and 9 anyway. Which is an interesting point because, and this is a great example of what we mean when we say child labor. We're not talking about a normal kid going to school anywhere in the world and then doing a paper run after work or working in a shop for 2 hours after work, after school. That's not what we're talking about. These kids were not going to school. They were possibly beaten and maltreated. They were taken from their families. The development is stunted. Horrific slavery, essentially, versus a child learning to help out, after their basic welfare and schooling is looked after.
No. Yeah, and I think the word dilemma is such a strong one in the case of social sustainability, but also environmental sustainability, because I think it's so difficult to find the perfect solution in so many cases. It's always somewhat of a trade-off, but obviously child labor shouldn't be a trade-off. And when I stumbled into this topic, it was very early on the cleanup journey. I had no ideas about global supply chain. Basically, we called our partners and said, "Hey, are your people paid minimum wage?" And I was like, yes. And then we had the first customers asking, "Okay, what is your code of conduct like?" And
Right.
that was also when I realized, okay, this is certainly not something where we can take a shortcut. We need to speak to experts, and this is when we got the introduction to you. And from everything that you've seen in waste, in fashion, right? These standards developed. We have the Ethical Trading Initiative in Germany. We have the SA 1000. We have the Fair Labor Association. All these different associations. Every company has a code of conduct that people seem to sign blindly in many cases.
Yes.
What makes a good social compliance program?
Okay, great. Yeah, so you nailed it firstly with the, not about signing a code of conduct blindly. That's not a great social compliance program. And I think it's especially interesting to think about this in terms of smaller companies, because a lot of companies have a big team and experts and house and that sort of thing. Whereas in a smaller company, it's harder. But yes, the things to be aware of is, you said it a second ago as well, that if you ask a supplier, any of us, if we were a supplier to anyone else, we're never going to admit openly to a non-compliance that's serious. Why would we do that when our business is at stake and our own livelihoods and those of people around us? So we should assume that asking a supplier directly about compliance is just not the most appropriate way to do this work. The most appropriate way is to communicate that code of conduct, but then really to actually utilize external expertise to people who are experienced in how to assess. And there is some asking suppliers about how they manage, but it's asking in intelligent ways rather than saying, "Do you comply?" What an expert does is on site says, "Let's have a look at your records. Do you even have the records if you're a very informal supplier who's never been assessed? Do you actually even track the working hours of all your workers?" We kind of have to go in presuming that sometimes they don't, that we actually need to be able to look at our suppliers and think about how big or how small they are, or how long they've been around, or whether they have other sort of customers with codes of conduct and assessment programs, and gauge a bit of where they might be already, and not make them wrong for that. Just know that we're beginning, and this is the terrible word we often use, but a journey together. We're beginning the work together of becoming better businesses, both of us. So coming at it that way, it's not that we're just going to check and tick box our supplier. Yes, we'll have a list of questions that expert who goes on the ground, who is a local expert. So I don't visit I have visited a Clean Hub supplier, but Joel, we've found experts in the country who I know have worked with Fair Labor Association and Ethical Trade Initiative and the industry, the huge expertise that understands the international standards and the local labor laws and the dynamics of, so the workers are coming from other parts of, say, India to this area. They're migrants. They might not speak the, Hindi or whichever language you're coming to the site with. And how do we appropriately talk to workers? And then how do we also cannot expect workers to directly just tell us violations. Because any of us, if someone external came to us, we don't want to badmouth our boss in front of our boss, right? None of us would want to do that unless we're a bit silly. And so we've got to be really sensitive to that fact that particularly in supply chains, the people we're talking to are even more vulnerable. They earn even less than any of us. And therefore, the job matters even more. And so they're going to be really careful. And so I've many times had Chinese workers, for example, when I was interviewing workers in China with my Chinese colleagues, I knew were lying to me about the conditions. And that's okay, because I had to find other ways where I would help the Chinese team to talk outside the factory, unannounced, confidentially with workers, so that they can tell the truth. And that's when we'd find out what was really going on. But then also the other half, my role became to engage management and help them understand that, yes, we have this code of conduct, and it's not just that that's aspirational, but we do recognize that you probably don't comply with all of it immediately. And we and maybe other customers of yours are going to support and do our best to support and do our best to reward you to improve in any areas you were not paying wages properly, or had excessive working hours, or not doing safety properly, or hadn't provided workers with contracts or the correct contracts. Or we've made big achievements with Clean Hub suppliers on social insurance, which Lakshmi on your team and myself together, we're really proud of. That we know that this was really tricky for some of these small suppliers who were new businesses. They're still learning how to set things up when we went to them. And when we sent in an Indian assessor with Lakshmi on your team, they discovered that, here's an area that, we need to upgrade things. And it's been fantastic to see that happen in some sites and to have that dialogue as well. So, but, it wouldn't be the same for me, a Westerner, to try to have, if I'm not someone who knows India, who speaks Hindi, who can talk to management. I have been to factories in India. I have talked with management, but there's so much more power in our Indian colleague experts actually being able to get really detailed and know the laws really well and know how difficult it is to register that with the local department, but we can still do it. And, what's reasonable in terms of a time frame. Just being really conscious that there's all these macro things going on. And I should probably mention also that companies need to be really conscious that there is an industry, unfortunately, of social assessors, some of who didn't really care about human rights as their main focus, and maybe worked historically in product quality testing or something, and occasionally will take bribes from suppliers to say that factory's fine, there's barely any problems. And so it's really on the part of a company looking at their supply chain to tap into, as you said there, either people like myself, if you're too small to maybe join the Ethical Trading Initiative or the Fair Labor Association, or maybe joining those organizations or similar in your sector, to be aware of that and then be able to find those assessors who are more ethical, who have dedicated their life's work to labor standards, and who really also very focused on genuinely wanting to help those factories or those sites improve, because they really love seeing those improvements for workers. um, and doing that coaching rather than just turn up and tick box things and tell a site how terrible they are and leave. That doesn't really help anyone. So yeah, these pieces beyond kind of just saying we have a code of conduct that are the real work, as you started the conversation with, Joel.
Yeah, and I want to go back to that story you just shared of the kids in this back alley, and you said something, and this happens to me often in our conversations, that surprises me, that you said it was a good thing that our supplier or the person contracting us was taking me there, because in the beginning, when I got into social auditing, I was so nervous about everything. And I think this was one of the first fears that you took from me and said, it's like, relax, this is our job to go in there and to find the things that are not going well. And if things are not going well, that's not necessarily bad news, but actually this is the starting point. And I was like, what about...
This is the social impact opportunity. You can improve lives now.
Yeah. And I even remember that I asked you about child labor, and you said, and I framed it as a red flag, and you said, this is not a red flag necessarily. It's like, it depends on who your supplier is and how willing they are to improve. And this became so core to my thinking about it that I don't get too nervous about this anymore.
You're engaging and causing those real improvements.
Yeah.
And if we were to ever find that, which we haven't, it's the nature of it. I mean, I've dealt with cases with other companies where there was a 15-year-old, and in China, the legal age is 16. And so technically that person is child labor, and that's clear. But the challenges around the world at 15, many of us want to start work, maybe if you're not going on to university or something. And so it was a matter of, well, actually, we worked on cases where with the factory, and this was bigger factories who could afford it. There's a lot more money involved. They're not tiny little sites. They funded that young person to go into technical training in a training institute for a year, because they sort of, in China, the sort of high schooling system is very strict, a bit like Germany and the gymnasium and everything, which pathway. And so they'd sort of lost the main academic pathway. So they were in education, and then once they turned 16, they had a job they could come back to. And then in China, in many countries, you have a law around 16 to 18-year-olds that they're treated more carefully for health reasons, for safety reasons, so that your development is still fair, but you can work with those protections. So those are some easier cases. There are cases around of people fighting 12-year-olds in their supply chain. And then again, depending on the nature of the relationship, with your trading relationship, shall we say, the best case scenario, if it's possible, is that somehow that young person is funded for the difference of the years until they reach the age of 15. To be in education where they should be, and generally manufacturing work, or sort of the type of work we're talking about, is not considered safe for under age 15 to work with those machines that are squashing things and the chance of losing fingers and everything. So again, a paper round or something after school is fine, and many of us have done things like that when we were younger. But yeah, we're talking about a heavy industry environment, with exposure to dust and all sorts of things that when your body is younger, it can't handle quite as easily or as well.
And you know what another thing that was really surprising for me is we're obviously not the first ones that enter the sector. And I've been to facilities that proudly wear big household name brands on the door. Then you step through the door and these buildings don't even have a roof. There's people sitting in the mud sorting through waste, people walking barefoot. And when I started this, and even still to date, when I have conversations, it seems like there's no standard in the waste industry for these social topics, and yet it's such a discussed topic. And every conference I go is like, what do we do about working conditions in the informal sector or in the waste sector, not necessarily just the informal sector? Like, I want to play that question back to you, because it was 6 years ago when we went on that first call. You were like, tack, tack, tack. These are the steps that we take. These are the codes or these are the standards from which I pull together your code of conduct. How does someone start?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you just said it there, which is that there's some great standards out there. The Ethical Trading Initiative, Fair Labor Association, SA 8000, they're actually incredibly similar if you go out and read the three of them right now, if you look them up. And so what we did was we pulled from all three, we put them into one because they basically say almost the same thing, so that your customers, the Clean Hub customers, will know that we're meeting their standards, which will likely draw most of the time from one of the three of those codes. That's what we're working on. And so as the waste industry looks at having a waste industry standard, I would recommend, we had this big learning in the world of global supply chain social compliance, which is don't reinvent the wheel. You know, trade unions, worker representatives, NGOs, the ILO, governments, business, all input to those standards and have refined them over the past 20, 30 years. So there's no need to try and do all the work again. The standard, take the Clean Hub standard and offer it back to the sector. Is what?
By the way,
standard.
feel free. It's on the website. You can take it.
Yeah, it's on the website. So that's our first contribution, is that in terms of an actual code, that's not the hard work. That did take us a little bit of getting it all right, and a call out right now to Saif Khan, who did a bit of work on that. He was great. And then really it's about again, a lot of work has been done on how you do due diligence, human rights due diligence and responsible sourcing. So much work has been done that we now have an EU directive, which is under big debates. But the debate around that, the EU CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive at the moment, so we're currently in the first day of December 2025, and so that's still under a little bit of debate right now. The debate is actually not about the human rights due diligence process. The debate's about whether climate targets get included and which companies get included. It's not how do we do human rights due diligence. We kind of know. So, and that EU legislation pulls from OECD guidance, which has been again developed with lots of companies and NGOs and trade unions and businesses and everybody inputting, and that drew from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 2011. So if you read that, and Pillar 2 is what does business do, you'll find it's a little bit sort of legalish, wordy. It's very good. And so those the OECD guidance and then the law, the EU CSDDD directive, take it into a lot more description of what you should do. But this is where joining those initiatives, such as the Ethical Trading Initiative or SAI, Social Accountability International, that run the SA 8000 standard, or any of these other initiatives, is where you can actually learn how to do the doing. Right? And then, you could say, ask, and actually, SA 8000 have actually started, had some projects funded over the years, in recent years, around the plastic and waste industry. And so they've been trying to take those principles from many industries and how can it be tailored even more to the sector. So, Yeah, to speak to your point though about the going to sites where big company, big household names are buying from or doing business with them, and yet we get there and we're finding that the conditions are pretty atrocious. I mean, a couple of things there. Firstly, a lot of industries haven't really looked at waste. They've just looked at, we make this t-shirt or this shoe or whatever, and they haven't really looked at that other supply chain, so to speak. So firstly is those laws I just mentioned, the EUCS Triple D, talk about a risk-based approach. So actually the risk to people. And if you look again at the risk to people, waste should be starting to leap out for you if you're a big multinational household brand or even a smaller household brand. And so that would be where more and more companies have been going, oh goodness, as you said, Joel, in the conferences, waste, oh my goodness, what do we do? And then secondly, you sort of started again by acknowledging this, which is that we talk about this industry being very different to even a so-called sweatshop garment factory in that it's can be dirty and dangerous work and demeaning. So the 3Ds. And we've got to be really conscious when we go in that historically everybody's been allowed to see no evil, hear no evil, it's over there, which is why we love doing this work, because we're actually helping improve the lives of the people who need it the most.
Yeah, that's also why I was asking earlier, is like what got this entire wave rolling back in the early 2000s to run the audits in the sweatshops, right? Because the same should apply to waste management facilities.
Exactly.
This is where all our stuff ends up. Everybody's stuff ends up in these facilities.
Right. Yeah.
And responsibility just...
I mean, the other angle is value. As you just said, the responsibility has stopped. Historically, it's been how are my things made? And now there's a bit of a looking, and it's still a real challenge to go, oh gosh, we also need to do the work of what happens after they're made. And environmentally, there's a bit of that happening. Socially, you're quite right. We're early days-ish in a way there.
And especially since more and more material is also coming out of that waste back into supply chains, right? If we believe in the circular economy,
yes, exactly.
These are the miners of the future, basically. So
yeah, and we've seen some companies, I think really looking at and trying to engage their supply chains. I mean, I think Adidas and a few others who are already leaders on corporate human rights due diligence have been trying to look at, because of that circular, because of trying to use recycled materials, which is fantastic. But others go under the radar a bit because they're just not the spotlight. And this is why, if there's one thing everyone can do, be you in the name of your business or as an individual, is to help support the push for those laws. Because if the law's not there, you'll get a leader like Adidas or Clean Hub who try to do the right thing. And then all these other companies we forget the names of who go under the radar. And because they're not going to make a headline, a clickbait for an article. People aren't going to click if you put Pepco. Who's Pepco, you will ask? It's actually a huge retailer of cheap clothing across Europe, but a lot of people don't even remember they're there. And so you're not going to click the news article, and we pay pay-per-click these days. And so we need those laws so that everybody needs to improve their business human rights due diligence. And, that push in Europe for the EUCS Triple D, the EU, there's a conversation now. And in the US and Europe have these bans on imports of goods made by forced labor, which the UK needs as well. So like a really quick action everyone can do is go and find those industry letters and petitions that push for these laws and tell policymakers that we need that clear guidance for everybody so that then there's more resources. And then I would say then that brings us to collaboration, which you talked about, nascent in the waste industry, that at least the room is talking about the need for decent work in the industry. And then collaborating on codes of conduct has already been done, collaborating on guidance. And then we get to collaborating on site, which we've looked at once or twice for the Clean Hub map. We always check and try to check, is anyone else buying for, or working with this facility who might have a great responsible sourcing program? Let's not give that site manager mixed messages from two different business partners. let's give them a clear roadmap of what they need to improve and why and how, and join forces. And I've done this with many of the world's. This is why I know about the Adidas program or the Nike program, because I worked with them on shared suppliers when I worked in a different brand and worked with many different companies. It is legal for you to discuss social compliance, so the labor conditions and health, safety, and environmental conditions in a supplier. And you need to make your own business decisions so that you're not breaching antitrust. You need to decide how, your volumes, your pricing yourselves, and not talk about that with other buyers. But you are allowed to talk about, let's book an assessment together rather than duplicating it and wasting everybody's time. And then we have industry tools around that. I'm just careful in referencing that because some of those sharing of audit reports is where we get the reports with the fake records and the bribed auditors and things like that. So the more hands-on collaboration can have a fantastic impact. Suppliers have thanked me for that sometimes when we've tried to do it because they're so sick of getting 10, 20 audits a year, which doesn't help them. They'd much rather, a couple of audits to check progress a year and then a lot more, how do I learn how to do this? Why do I need to do that? That kind of thing.
No. And these are basically the two points that I still want to touch on. The first one being to summarize, basically, if your company knows how to do human rights due diligence, then you're already in a good spot. You don't need to wait for another piece of standard to come out.
Well, you've got to keep refining and making sure it doesn't have fake data coming in and things like
that. Yeah, for sure. But there's no need to wait to start. That's, I think, the important one. You don't need to go to another conference and talk about how bad the working conditions are. You can already start working based on what is out there.
And you don't need to fly someone from Europe to India to assess a site in India.
No, I can say great auditors in India, in Indonesia that I met thanks to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's point one. And then point two is, you mentioned earlier, this is where you learn how to do the doing. Can you run me through how a good first audit works and what is the outcome of that and why one should not be nervous about the outcome? Okay. That's already 3 questions. So let's start with one. What happens after the code of conduct is written?
So look, the reality is any of us being audited might feel a bit nervous. It's quite common that a lot of sites will. And so we need to acknowledge that. We need to say something along the line and try to be a bit human and friendly in our approach, that we realize you might be feeling a bit nervous, but we need to book this audit because we have expectations on us from our customers that not only do we care, but our customers also care that you understand the laws and the standards. And we see this as the beginning of work together. So we want to come at it with a frame that we really want to work with this supplier, business partner, and therefore we're going to expect that there's probably some things that are not in compliance. And so we want to help the supplier understand that we're not expecting perfection. We'll often write a line saying that. We're expecting to understand your challenges and realities. And then maybe we can help point you to ways to be a better business, essentially, to reduce your risks and our risks and improve things and be a more productive workplace. So, getting that email and that phone call before an audit right, there's no perfect way to do it. And you want to, maybe if the supplier has other customers, you might say this will help you meet the expectations of not only us, but other customers as well. That's something to sort of try and encourage them to understand. And then we are saying we're sending in experts who'll be assessing your baseline against our code of conduct. And here's the code of conduct. And we would often tell them that, they're going to need access to the human resources person, to records around wages and working hours if you have them. Depending on how small and informal the site is, sometimes they don't really track working hours yet, that kind of thing. So, sometimes that's a finding just in the immediate first process. And we want to get the message across that we value their transparency and honesty far more than we value perfection. Because or otherwise, fake records is an industry. And that doesn't reduce risk for you as the buyer or the business partner or for workers or for anybody to just get that. And then that focus, as I said, on our intention is to work with you and to help encourage improvements. And then we've got local experts going on the ground. They'll often be discussing some of this maybe in local language before the visit as well to get real clarity. And that's where sometimes the supplier is really nervous and phoning them going, what's really going on? Oh my God. And if they're very new to this work. And sort of helping them calm down. It's okay. It's going to be a good. It's not going to be a terrible experience. This buyer really is mature and does understand that, things are not perfect for a tiny little waste site, right? And then they're going on site on the day that's agreed. Now, look, in a perfect case in the long run, to try to have unannounced audits with off-site worker interviewing in advance is best practice. But when we're just starting and we're just building the relationship, we're going in announced because they don't know who the hell we are and it's the beginning. And often we find in this industry that they're being very open and honest. We're able to build that trust. We're able to build their trust in us. And then the assessment happens by an opening meeting, often with management, and a little tour of the site. These are pretty small sites. It's pretty fast. And then starting to have discussions with workers. We've had assessors who often have a worker interviewer, a local worker interviewer with them as well. So there are two people interviewing so that there's a female as well because a lot of the workers are female. And because of those local dialects sometimes of migrant workers and things like that. And they're trying to find ways to talk to as many workers as possible so that no comment could be attributed back to one worker. That you said that, we don't want anyone to get fired for this process or any retribution. So we've got to be really careful and sensitive. And this is why the expertise is so important. And it's almost easier in a big factory with 5,000 workers because you can interview a lot more people and not attribute things back to people. So we've got a really delicate, careful situation in these smaller waste sites. But again, if you've built that trust with management at the beginning, management themselves will often admit, well, we didn't know about such and such. We haven't been doing such and such. And then the auditor is creating that laundry list, so to speak, of the things that need improving. But as I said, if they can find the time on the site, they're trying to move into, well, why would it be important to make these improvements? And sometimes, how might you do that? Either I can tell you how today, or I might need to point you off to a training, and maybe there's something locally even where you can go in person. Occasionally, we find sites where it's about they need a better health safety person or something like that. So there's going to have to have the person to get the training. So we've got to be really conscious that there's sort of these multiple dynamics sometimes going on. Sometimes we're having to loop back to managers who are not on site after the assessment. And so there is closing the day or 2 days on site with a wrap-up meeting to the site manager saying, here are the things we've found and that we want to see some progress on. We're going to be discussing some timelines with you. But often we'll need to also take that to other managers who may not have been on site that day, more senior directors or owners or things. But sometimes they're there on site. It just varies depending on the site. But a lot of circling with workers and management and looking around site. And when I've visited, you can walk around and you can see, and we get into some complexities of, what are the safety standards for machinery and waste processing? It's tricky. There's some real, we need to do some work on our side to dig into, you've got this machine. Oh, goodness, let us try to check what the most appropriate way to keep workers safe with that might be.
Mhm.
And then, Joel, the dilemma point that you said was so key. We're sometimes saying, as a first immediate cost, we're often talking about some PPE or safety equipment that we know costs money. And so there's sometimes a discussion between a company like yourselves and that assessor and maybe the site about what's it really going to cost and when can we afford it, and is the business really going to continue with a buyer like you because they need to be able to afford it. And and then the sort of wages issues are even more of a dilemma. And this is global everywhere, that, trying to get to legal minimum wage is the key one we're working on first. Overtime pay that's correct, fully in line with the law for every hour worked is a real challenge for small and more informal sites that are not a big corporate that's been around for many years. But then we've also been raising the conversation and trying to map at times if there's still a gap there before living wage. We've been getting social insurances in place. And as I said, that's often, that's a conversation a bit back and forth. What's the situation in your province, your town, your region? And what does it mean for these workers? Where did the workers come from? And the complications around making sure that when we do it, it's actually going to work for workers. And then that can, and I think we've seen this, give a real benefit to that site manager, that those workers are now in a job where they're like, I've got better benefits, I want to stay here. So we've got some productivity benefits starting to come through for that site, that they can keep their workforce better. They're not scrambling around for workforce all the time.
No.
But those are all big conversations to keep having, and people are busy.
This is where the journey that you mentioned starts, right? Because maybe as a last point on the technicalities, what's the outcome of this first baseline audit? What is the document? How do we continue from there?
Sure. Yeah. So we from the first baseline audit, we'll sometimes have a full report documenting what happened, who went on site, what was the process. But the most important piece really is what we call the CAP, the Compliance Action Plan. Sometimes people call it a CAPAR, and compliance action plan. Okay, it's slightly heavy, but it's an action plan, and it's really where we've documented. Here's what we found. We might be saying here's the specific law in the country or the clause of the code that it was a violation against, and or the aspiration we want to see around a good health safety standard. And here's how we think it should be improved. And that becomes a dialogue. And then there's the when would the site commit to do it by. And that's that dialogue of, well, we think you should be able to do it within 3 weeks. And they say, oh, no, it's going to take 4 or 5 weeks. But why is that? Let's just understand that. Oh, is that realistic? Yes or no? That local expertise and experience and dedication to this work is where that's so crucial, to be really realistic there about what is achievable for sites of a certain size and that sort of thing. And so then that document is shared between you, the buyer, drafted by the auditor, the social auditor, the assessor, but then input by both the supplier and the buyer, and in best case, kind of signed off and everybody's agreed. But really, the most important point is we're getting on with the action after that. And then, as you say, that leads into the real work of following up. And so hopefully, your business, and this is where, Clean Hub has, despite sort of being really small and growing over recent years, really tried to build in that there is that reward to business partners, that they've been open and transparent and improving things, and therefore their business with Clean Hub has continued or maybe grown. And that's the value for them. And that's the value for the workers as well, that those improvements are sustainable for them, because the revenue comes and the revenue gets passed on to the people doing the work, doing the waste processing. But everybody's winning. And we've reduced risk for Clean Hub and Clean Hub customers, and we're having that social impact on the ground. But we're monitoring that over weeks and months and years. And that's what many companies do with responsible sourcing programs. And that's the gutsy work. And that's why I'm saying you don't just rely on one audit report and shelf it in a folder somewhere. You're actually ongoingly engaging with that supplier. You've got a great team, Lakshmi and Rizal on the Clean Hub website, who who do a lot of that. Everybody gets busy, we're all scrambling to try to cover a lot of things, but really working on engaging on those improvements again and again, and bringing dilemmas back at times, and asking for more senior support when needed to, get big decisions made. And then there's all the things we can do operationally, locally, just ongoingly keeping them moving. Looking out for more trainings, looking out for what we learn about even better safety standards in this sector and things like that.
No. And I think at this point, I also want to give props to our partners who are really doing a fantastic job of dealing with it, improving things. And the results are getting better and better. So that's also good to see. And this was one of the questions that I still wanted to ask. You mentioned baseline, what's going on where, right? And for me, when I got into this, I realized that I have more unknowns about this space than I thought. And at the same time, I was socialized in Germany. Then you have people that grow up in China and India, where they have a different sense for what is normal. And then the waste sector typically also doesn't work with international clients because it's not something that you export. It's a local service, and suddenly somebody comes in and says, hey, these are the international rules that you have to obey by. Maybe they're not even horrible people. Maybe even the bosses of those kids in that street were not horrible people, but that's just what they thought was normal and how things should be.
Yeah.
Why should a supplier work towards these international standards? You drop these breadcrumbs here and there, but maybe it's worth summarizing it once more.
So the biggest reason a supplier should work towards them is to keep their buyers like this, which helps them keep their business going at all. But parking that for a moment, we see. So I've seen a worker faint in a factory in Cambodia. That's not productivity. Everybody stops, looks around. They're not working. Everybody, that worker is not working. The manager who comes to look after them is not working. Nobody's working for that 5 or 10 minutes, and the 3 of them are not working for half an hour or more. So preventing health and safety has immediate productivity benefits in companies. Having a finger cut off, having a finger stamped, falling over. I've seen a factory have a fire and lose everything. It actually does happen, this stuff. So the reason a supplier or anybody running an operation should be thinking about health and safety is productivity. Is what is the point of me, paying people if they can't get the job done in the time in appropriate ways? And the disruption that causes, and that, if people feel like the workplace is really unsafe, if they find a safer opportunity somewhere else with the same wages, they'll go there. Yeah. So there's a lot of business reasons, and that's still a conversation for us to have with partners, is reminding them that and helping them think about that, and helping them think, we have to be aware that they have to balance that with the cost sometimes of PPE, so that protective equipment, or machine safety, or processes, or fire safety, things like that. But, again, having your whole little waste collection sorting facility burned down overnight doesn't help anybody. So if we can help you prevent it burning down, surely we're helping you, right? Again, I've seen them burn down. It really does happen. And I don't mean in the waste industry. I've seen it in other industries where you would think there's even less chance of it happening. So it is a real thing that fire safety really matters, that people not falling over and banging into things and getting their arms cut off and whatever is really important. And then we can sort of say the same around wages and hours and contracts and what we call social insurance, which means benefits, which means, rights to medical care in many countries, or to pensions and things like that. That if you're not paying people decently, and we hear this sometimes from workers that they will be looking for other jobs somewhere, and then you're fluffing around trying to spend money hiring new people. We've also come across cases where not treating people fully in line with the standards shows sort of actually points to deeper what we call root causes of a lack of really good communication as well between supervisors and workers, and a lack of good management. And there's whole industries out there that try to train business to understand better management, because we know it's really valuable to how you improve profitability of an operation is if you manage your people better. So sometimes what we're finding on compliance is an indicator that, how can we improve your organization's management, just like most businesses are often trying to do. And therefore keep your people, keep the ones you want, appropriately and legally. If you need to occasionally phase a worker out who wasn't ever going to be trainable and do the job, then fine, but you do it in an ethical and appropriate way so everybody else feels really fair and that person had a fair chance. And now you've got a team of people who really want to be there and are making your business more profitable and making it happen and growing your amazing work in the, to call out the cleanup suppliers again, of preventing plastic from reaching the oceans. Yay! A lot of these local people who are doing the sorting care about it as well, right? They want their operation to collect and sort and prevent as much plastic waste as possible. And so they can go home at night and, sleep and have sufficient food and pay the rent or the bills or whatever may need to be done. So, we've got to really talk about this work being about being better businesses. That, yes, there's the ethical side about how we treat people, but there's reasons for the ethical side that also help us all be better businesses. And there's loads of science out there and research studies and you name it if you want to look into it. But there's just the really logical point of put yourself in that worker's shoes, think about those impacts. And yeah, it's a little bit of work to update your contracts and make them fairer or whatever it may be. But yeah, it's like this short-termism of today versus the next few weeks, months, and years of why am I in this business in the first place, right? I'm here to have something grow over time.
No. And then
sustainably.
Yeah, that's the point. And this brings me to the closing topic. You mentioned communication earlier. This is mostly internal. I want to talk a bit about external. How do I communicate social impact? Because there's two sides. One says do good and don't talk about it. The other says do good and do talk about it, because that might influence others to change. I find this really, really difficult.
Sure.
Also because I don't want to put myself on the moral high ground or elevate myself over others in the way how we conduct things. And it feels to me, as soon as you start communicating about things that you want to change and that you're trying to do good, at least in Germany, people get super suspicious. And this is where you're becoming more of a target. And they say, I'm going to prove to the market that what they're saying, there are holes in there.
Right.
So this is the final dilemma. You
Well,
try to
sure. And you said it well, that look, there always are holes. And so the first thing in the world of sustainability and communications as a corporate, especially too, is just to say we're not perfect. That's the first thing people need to say. And so I absolutely hate it when I go on a website that says, we checked all our supplies and we found no issues. Because I look at that and I say, you didn't check properly. You don't even know how to check properly, or you don't care. So the first thing is to just be realistic. It's a big wide world out there. And if we're working in it, even in Germany, there are issues in warehouses and for office cleaners and you name it. There are issues everywhere. And this is ongoing work as standards increase over time as well, as we learn how to create better PPE. We went from, one type of mask to another type of mask, etc. So the standards improve over time. So the first thing is to say we're imperfect. That's the absolute most important message. The second point, we're trying to learn from others, which we've tried to do in, at least in some ways, trying to pull from those other codes of conduct for labor association, understanding that there was this development of human rights due diligence, that we're trying to hear the voice of workers. I think that's a really important piece when we're talking about this decent work stage, and that we're working on continuous improvement and we're engaging. And so the rest of it, if those principles are coming through, and I do think we make a decent effort at that, we're not perfect, then now that's a big part of it. And we need to be responsible to educate those readers that this is tough work. This is an industry, and I think we say this on the Clean Hub website, that this is an industry that it is new to. Historically, people didn't look at the conditions, as you pointed out, Joel, for workers in this industry. And so as an industry, everybody's, or those who are looking, are quite new to looking and trying to engage. And it doesn't attract, the shiniest, most world-class, fancy factories in the world. It's waste, it's rubbish, it's junk, that's what this industry is. And then I think we speak a little bit to the steps along the way. So as I say, one of the ones we're really proud of, and I'm not saying it's perfected, but is really trying to get some traction for workers in one of the India partners. And again, kudos to that partner who really listened and went, oh yeah, you're quite right. It would be sensible to get to struggle as a quite new early business to get the social insurance for our workers. And it was a bit of a breakthrough for them to get some of that under a very tricky local governmental regime, and then to offer that. And then we're sort of trying to track that impact, and it's ongoing work to keep tracking that that's working, that that's the right thing, that we've got that right, or what's changing in the local environment. So we need to sort of keep trying to explain the challenges to the readers and explain that this is work, and that we are aware that if we don't do it in gutsy ways, then we go down the risk of being just presented fake records and people lying to us, and then nobody wins. Right. So it's hard. It's not only on us. And, there are good reporters out there and media people who do try to get their head around the complexity, but a little bit of onus on them to do that as well, I would say, if they're listening or anyone knows any, but many do. But yeah, on our side is to just keep stressing that nobody has this perfect, even if they say they do. At the same time, that we need to do things. Can't just sit there and go, it's imperfect, it's impossible. That's not true either. We need to actually get work done. We need to use local expertise, which is why you see Lakshmi and Rizal on the Clean Hub website. And your team has been growing with the local expertise and with the partners they use. And then we need to keep engaging our suppliers, because you can't turn everything around overnight anywhere. You have to incrementally influence from the most serious issues through to those, other ones along the way. And that's just the challenge of comms and
Yeah,
website writing.
it's again a bit of a dilemma, because I feel the more mature your counterparty is in these conversations, the more they will know about this anyway. The
Yeah,
less mature,
we got to educate.
it more rings almost like alarm bells when you say like, hey, not everything in our operations is perfect. And then they might go with somebody that claims that everything is perfect.
But we're working on it,
yeah.
and we're aware of it more than many others are. Yeah.
It's a slippery slope. I'm very happy to have you consulting us.
No, it's fantastic. helping Clean Hub. And look, again, and call out to Ajay and other people around the world who've done really good work of going in sites and helping us understand years ago what Clean Hub could influence to improve lives. And I feel slightly emotional saying that, because of your honesty and your courage there, Joel, and your colleagues, your team, your exec team, your willingness to understand and learn, you are improving lives on the ground. And yes, we want to do more of that. And we're constantly learning because we're a growing organization. But that's the reality of what we're up to. And that's a good thing. And it also helps business grow. So yay. And it helps your customers, get more focus on reducing their plastic use. Yeah.
And I think the majority of kudos in this case actually goes to Lakshmi, Rizal, and Anita. I think hearing stories that people open up, even about things that happen outside of the factory in their lives, from workers of companies that are not our own.
They're doing some great work. Yeah. I'm very proud of really, really striving to help the workers feel that they can trust and share, and that doesn't need to be something to worry about. And we'll do our best somehow to do what we can. Nobody can do everything, but we'll do the bits that we can, and we'll keep trying to figure it out.
Absolutely. And none of this is IP. Our standard is open. Kate's contact details, I don't want to spoil her here, but you can get in touch with her. You can, if you're in this industry, this is pre-competitive.
Yeah,
Work that needs to be done by everyone.
Yes.
If you don't want to do it yourselves, we're happy to do it for you.
Let's get more plastic prevented from the oceans and make sure that the people who are part of helping them do that have decent work and a fair chance. And we just keep improving that for everyone towards that, as the full, the highest level possible, essentially. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kate. It was fantastic speaking with you.
Great to speak with you. Thanks. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube and our Instagram.
The Striving, presented by Clean Hub.